Glad to welcome you all here to SAIS. I'm the Dean of the Faculty and Head of China Studies here at SAIS, and this is another opportunity for SAIS to cooperate with NBR, and we're most pleased to do so, particularly on the Strategic Asia project. This year's project deals with a core question, and it's really how do the countries in Asia, South Asia, East Asia, and the whole region deal with a rising China to take advantage of the benefits that would accrue through cooperation, and at the same time hedge against the downsides that could conceivably develop in the security area as China becomes stronger and stronger. That's not the sole theme, but it's certainly an important theme of what this volume is about, and what about which the discussion will revolve in substantial portion. Before I introduce Travis Tanner from NBR, let me just acknowledge the passing of an old friend to many of us in this room, and certainly an American who contributed an enormous amount, General John Shalikashvili. He was a longtime advisor to NBR. There's a chair named for him. He was the first foreign-born citizen of the foreign-born, became a citizen of the United States, rose from the enlisted ranks to the most senior uniformed officer in the history of in the United States. In any case, he passed away in July. He, in very substantial measure, inspired Strategic Asia, and we certainly want to acknowledge with a sense of pride and gratefulness for all he contributed both to NBR, to many of us personally, and I had the opportunity to travel to China and Taiwan with him on more than one occasion. Now, what I would like to do is just introduce Travis Tanner, who will introduce our keynote speaker. It gives me particular personal pride to introduce Travis. He's an alum of SAIS. He was a colleague at what we then called the Nixon Center, and I guess is now called the Center for National Interest. He was a co-author on several studies. We were co-authors together. And he now is director of the Pyle Center at NBR and responsible for Strategic Asia. So with pride, I present Travis Tanner.
Thank you so much, Mike, and thank you everyone for being here this morning. If you'll note on your agenda, Rich Ellings, the president of NBR, was scheduled to be here this morning, and he sends his regrets, asked that he be excused this morning. He flew out from Seattle yesterday, especially to be here for today's event, and unfortunately fell ill last night, so will not be joining us. So our best wishes are out there for Rich that he'll feel better. So I would like to thank Mike Lampton and Johns Hopkins SAIS especially for co-sponsoring this event again with NBR. Just to give you a little bit of insight and background here as well, Mike is the winner of the inaugural Robert A. Scalapino Prize that is awarded biannually by NBR and the Woodrow Wilson Center as a centerpiece of the National Asia Research Program. This is the Scalapino Award recognizes Professor Lampton for his extraordinary accomplishments in his career, including in scholarship, for all that he has done to address the key Asia policy issues of our time, and for all that he's done in representing American interests in his long-standing and deep engagement with Asia over those years. So on behalf of Rich, on behalf of NBR and myself, Mike, it's truly a pleasure to share this dais with you today. So thank you. A little bit of background before I introduce our keynote speaker today. I'd like to talk a little bit about the Strategic Asia program and offer some thanks to a couple of other institutions. I'd like to thank the Bradley Foundation and the National Nuclear Security Administration. Both institutions have been wonderful supporters of the Strategic Asia program for many, many years. Without their support, the program simply just would not exist today. And thank everyone that has made it out through, despite the poor weather conditions today, to commemorate this book launch of the 11th volume in the Strategic Asia series. Yes, actually 11 volumes. this has been going on. So we're excited to begin the second decade of providing this resource of expert, timely, and insightful analysis to decision makers around the world. The Strategic Asia program does just that. It brings together top Asia studies specialists and international relations experts to assess the strategic environment in the Asia-Pacific each year. The program has three main objectives. First is to provide a comprehensive understanding of the strategic environment in Asia. Second, to look forward 5 years and to really contemplate what are the most important aspects of the evolving strategic situation, and then assess what are those implications for the United States. And then finally is to establish a record of data and assessment to assist those that are interested in understanding the implications for regional stability. The program produces an annual volume, an executive brief, and provides briefings for congressional committees, for the Departments of Defense and Energy, State Department, for the National Security Council, for the intelligence community, and for business leaders. In addition, the program manages a unique, one-of-a-kind online database that covers 70 indicators across 37 countries in Asia. And we're really excited this year that it's been upgraded and updated and now includes an interactive mapping tool that tracks current Asian military developments. So this includes the location of military assets, international exercises, peacekeeping operations, and so forth. So as you enter the building today there in the lobby, some of you may have seen the large screen there that was demonstrating the new database and this interactive mapping tool. And if you didn't have the opportunity to see that, as I mentioned, it's new and updated this year, so we would encourage you to take a look at the display on your way out and pick up a copy of the informational flyer so that you can log on, take a look at that, and provide us with any feedback that you might have. So we're very privileged today to have with us my wonderful keynote speaker, the Assistant Secretary for State for South and Central Asian Affairs, Ambassador Robert Blake. Following his remarks, we'll then have a short break, and we'll welcome our panel presenters, 4 of our chapter contributors to this year's Strategic Asia volume here to the front, as well as a respondent who will be providing comments. So for now, what I'd like to do, it's my honor to introduce the esteemed Assistant Secretary of State for South and Central Asian Affairs, Robert Blake. Ambassador Blake has made a career as a Foreign Service officer, serving in such far-flung places as Tunisia, Algeria, Nigeria, Egypt, eventually reaching the rank of ambassador, in which capacity he served in Sri Lanka during a time of civil war there, and provided a lot of great service to that country. So previous to that, he was the Chief of Mission in New Delhi, India. And notable today in particular is that something that I want to point out is that he's an alumnus of the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, where we find ourselves today. So we're very grateful Ambassador Blake is here with us today. He's made a career of learning and living Asia policy, and for that we are very grateful for him to be here today to speak to us and to share his insights. So without further ado, I'll turn the time over to Ambassador Blake.
Well, thank you very much, Travis, for that nice introduction. And it's a pleasure to be back here at SAIS. I've just come back from 8 days at the UN General Assembly with Secretary Clinton, with our sort of annual meetings up there with all of our different partners. And so it's one of my first days back in the office, but it was an irresistible invitation both to come back to SAIS, to my alma mater, but also from my old friend Ashley Tellis, who's one of the editors of this volume. Ashley and I served together under Ambassador Bob Blackwell in the U.S. Embassy in New Delhi from 2003 to 2006. And, of course, India has been a great priority for me ever since then. I also served as ambassador in Sri Lanka from 2006 to 2009, where, again, worked very, very closely with India. It's a real pleasure to come here today to talk a little bit about this. I want to, again, pay tribute to NBR for their Strategic Asia series, and particularly for this latest volume, the 11th volume, and its focus on India and China, which I think is so important. And when I talk to a lot of the young Foreign Service officers of the next generation who are coming up, I always tell them that they should try to focus on India and China, because those are going to be probably our two most important partnerships of the 21st century. And so for those of you who are SAIS students in the audience, first of all, I encourage you to consider a career in the State Department. It's been a terrific experience, but also to focus on India and China, because I do believe they're going to be so very, very important. I know my colleague Kurt Campbell spoke last year at this event, and he obviously is much better equipped to talk about China. I thought I would try to focus my remarks a little bit today about all the things that we're trying to do in India to advance our strategic partnership. I'd like to particularly focus my remarks on Secretary Clinton's recent travels to India for the second U.S.-India Strategic Dialogue, and to discuss our support for India's broadened engagement in Asia, which was really the crux of a major foreign policy speech that Secretary Clinton gave in Chennai right after the second Strategic Dialogue in July. Her visit to India was part of a much larger trip that was called the Odyssey by many of the wags inside the State Department, because she went entirely around the world in about 12 days and, as usual, looked much more chipper than all the rest of us at the end of it. But obviously a very key stop on that was the trip to India, where she co-chaired with External Affairs Minister Krishna our second strategic dialogue, almost 2 years to the day after her first visit as Secretary of State to India. The relationship between the United States and India has come a very long way in just 2 years, from cooperation on defense and clean energy to education and space. I think that really the unprecedented breadth of our dialogue and our partnership has become one of its most distinguishing features. And what was striking this time around with this particular dialogue was really our strategic discussion on how to take our relations forward. And I'd like to just focus on 4 areas, if I might. One would be security and defense issues. Secondly, how we can re-energize the bilateral relationship on the economic front, and particularly the civil nuclear energy front. Third, the central role that we hope India will play in the new Silk Road vision that the Secretary articulated in Chennai. And last, deepening India's cooperation across the entire arc of the Asia-Pacific, from Aden all the way to Malacca. So let me just take each of those briefly in turn. Starting with security, I think the dialogue in July was really significantly bolstered by the presence of the Director of National Intelligence, General Clapper, as well as Deputy Secretary Lute from the Department of Homeland Security. And indeed, counterterrorism cooperation and intelligence cooperation has become a real center of focus for us, particularly since the terrible Mumbai attacks of November 2008. During the strategic dialogue, we announced a new cybersecurity agreement with India, as well as to try to create computer emergency response teams designed to make both of our countries more agile and prepared to respond to the growing threat from cyber attacks of various kinds. Our cooperation is rooted in the shared threat that we face as democracies and a sobering recognition of the dangerous neighborhood that India is located in. We remain deeply concerned about groups like Lashkar-e-Taiba that pose a serious threat not only to India, but to the United States, as well as to regional stability. Earlier this month, the United States announced the designation of Indian Mujahideen, a group with close links to Lashkar-e-Taiba, as a foreign terrorist organization. And we continue to press Pakistani authorities and demand that they do more to curtail not only the activities of the Haqqani network, but also LET activities, and bring the perpetrators of those Mumbai attacks to justice. On the military-to-military side of our security engagement, we're expanding every aspect of our bilateral cooperation in both scope and substance, from defense bilateral exchanges, exercises, and capacity building. Our militaries are finding ways to cooperate like never before. We've conducted over 50 bilateral military exercises with India over the last several years, and the United States has hosted over 100 military officers here just in the last year. In terms of defense sales, we've also seen some good progress. We've done over $8 billion of defense deals with India in the last decade, with a lot of recent momentum as a result of some important C-17 and C-130 sales. And of course, we know that not every deal is going to go our way, such as the recent multi-role combat aircraft deal, but we do believe that the long-term trajectory of the U.S.-India bilateral defense relationship is positive. Maritime security is another very, very important area of convergence and cooperation, driven by our shared interest in safeguarding freedom of navigation and ensuring the free flow of trade and energy supplies. We're very pleased to note that India has decided to chair a plenary next year of the contact group on piracy off the coast of Somalia. And I think this sends a very strong signal to the over 70 nations that participate in that contact group that India wants to take a lead on these very, very important issues. Turning to trade and investment, I think that sustaining the dynamic growth in our trade and investment between the United States and India is clearly a very top priority for our two countries. And let me highlight two areas in particular. First, the Secretary announced the resumption of technical discussions on a bilateral investment treaty, or a BIT, as is commonly known. This is important because of the growing volume of investment in both directions, not only to India, but also increasingly by Indian companies here in the United States. So a BIT obviously would be a very important way to protect and advance those growing flows in both directions. A second very high priority is our civil nuclear cooperation with India. Secretary Clinton underscored the importance of India's pledge to ratify the Convention on Supplementary Compensation and to ensure that its nuclear liability regime is consistent with international standards. In essence, we want to assure that having expended for several years now significant political capital in getting the civil nuclear agreement through our Congress and through the Nuclear Suppliers Group, that the U.S. and Indian companies as well will get to benefit from this historic agreement. So during the strategic dialogue, Secretary Clinton again urged our Indian friends to fulfill the promise of the civil nuclear agreement by ensuring a level playing field for U.S. companies. Now let me move to the aspect of the Secretary's trip that is probably of greatest interest to all of you today, India's rise in Asia. We have moved, as all of you know, from a transatlantic century to a trans-Pacific century, in which the rise of Asia has already started to define the 21st century. I think the Secretary's own words in Chennai are worth repeating. She said, "We understand that much of the history of the 21st century will be written in Asia, and that much of the future of Asia will be shaped by decisions not only of the Indian government in Delhi, but of governments across India, and perhaps most importantly, by the 1.3 billion people who live in India." As the center of geopolitics moves towards Asia, India plays a critical role in U.S. strategy. The United States sees India as a pillar of stability and prosperity in the Indian Ocean and beyond. India has long been a maritime power in Asia in its own right, and only India itself can chart a path to navigate the geopolitical currents that are unfolding before us. But we believe that India can leverage its democratic traditions, its strong cultural influence and people-to-people ties, and its booming economy to help ensure that the Asia of the 21st century is one defined by open markets, open societies, and open governments. Let me focus for a moment on the economic promise of India. As the Secretary said, we are betting that the opening of India's markets to the world will produce a more prosperous India and a more prosperous South Asia. Indeed, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Central Asia, and the wider region all can benefit from India's growing economic dynamism and efforts to forge growing regional integration. That's why Secretary Clinton first articulated her vision of a new Silk Road at a speech in Chennai in July after our strategic dialogue. She said it would not be a single thoroughfare, but an international web of economic, and transit connections that would include rail lines, highway infrastructure, and new energy infrastructure. The New Silk Road is a shared commitment to promote private sector investment, increase regional trade and transit, and foster a network of linkages throughout the region to help build up the Afghan private sector and grow the Afghan economy in order to create a stable and prosperous Afghanistan within a stable and prosperous region. The Afghan government put forward a vision for its economic future, focused on increased private sector investment and expanded regional trade and integration. This vision builds on many efforts that are already underway. For example, Afghanistan and Pakistan have agreed to a transit trade agreement that must now be implemented and then extended to Central Asia. Ultimately, everyone hopes that transit trade to India can be opened as well, so that products from Afghanistan and from Central Asia could transit through Pakistan to India and to countries like Bangladesh and beyond. The Indian and Pakistani Commerce Secretaries have been engaged in very important talks over the last several months to try to increase the volume of direct trade between their two countries that goes directly across the Wagah border. Opening transit trade to India would be truly transformative because India is going to be such an important economic anchor for the region in the 21st century. Another very important priority is to try to expand regional energy infrastructure. Already with the leadership of President Berdimuhamedov of Turkmenistan, the countries of Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and India have made quite important progress on the Tapi pipeline, which would bring natural gas from the fields of Turkmenistan through Afghanistan and Pakistan to the energy-hungry markets of India, with very important transit revenues going to both Afghanistan and Pakistan. The International Afghanistan Conference on Bonn in December 6th of this year will be a key opportunity for the governments of Afghanistan, its neighbors, and the broader international community to address how the international community can strengthen economic cooperation to comprehensively seize the opportunities afforded by the New Silk Road. Just as India will be an anchor of the New Silk Road, an India more integrated with the markets of the Asia-Pacific and one more engaged in Asia-Pacific security issues will benefit the region and Asia's multilateral fora. So what does this mean in practice? It might entail India seeking an increased role in the East Asia Summit, elevating and further deepening its interaction with ASEAN, and developing further political relations with East Asia that match India's vibrant trade and investment growth that has already occurred in that region. We will continue our highly successful East Asia sub-dialogue, something that I have worked very closely with my friend and colleague Kurt Campbell on, as well as kicking off our highly anticipated trilateral dialogue between the United States, India, and Japan later this fall. As Kurt Campbell has noted, one of the most important aspects of our Asia-Pacific strategy is to work more closely with India and to put meat on the bones of India's desire to play a prominent role in the Asia-Pacific region going forward. The fruits of such engagement would be many. It would stoke India's economy for the span of the 21st century and make the region and the world more secure. The United States stands ready to work with India to grow these linkages in Asia and partner to improve the lives of people across the Asian continent on issues from education to counterterrorism. The United States is also interested in working with India and other members of the East Asia Summit to make it the premier forum for Asia-Pacific leaders to discuss pressing security and strategic issues. And it's worth remembering that President Obama has announced that he plans to attend the 2011 East Asia Summit in Indonesia, providing yet another occasion for the United States and India to deepen our dialogue about security and economic architectures in Asia. Let me go out on a limb and anticipate an inevitable question that many of you will have. What about China? Our engagement across the Asia-Pacific region and our belief that India has a consequential role to play in the region will not in any way deflect from our strong relations with China. In fact, we see great promise in bringing China, India, and the United States even closer together, perhaps in formal capacities. As the Secretary said recently, if we want to address, manage, or solve some of the most pressing problems of the 21st century, India, China, and the United States will have to coordinate our efforts. And indeed, I think that's one of the focuses of today's conference, and we very much look forward to hearing some of your suggestions in that regard. Increased dialogue will be key. 21st century global peace and security may well be defined by the level of harmony achieved by our three great powers. Just as global trade and commerce was made secure by the Royal Navy in the 19th century and by the American Navy in the 20th century, perhaps it will be the cooperation of the American, Indian, and Chinese navies that ensure global commercial routes are protected and enhanced in the 21st century. It is for this very reason that eliminating the scourge of piracy could be a natural way for the United States, India, and China to begin to cooperate at sea. All told, harmony in the Asia-Pacific region will ensure that the United States, India, and China will guide the world towards an age of safety, prosperity, and innovation, a vision that is welcome news to the region and to the world. And I can't emphasize India's role enough. As again the Secretary noted in Chennai, India's leadership will help to shape positively the future of the Asia-Pacific region. So in conclusion, I want to salute all of you, but particularly NBR and SAIS, for your equally important efforts here today. As leading academics, business leaders, and strategists, your advice and your counsel will be crucial in shaping the geopolitics of Asia and advancing prosperity and security across the entire Trans-Pacific region. So again, I want to thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to come here today. Wish you great success in your deliberations. And let me apologize in advance. I've got to go off now and give yet another speech about Uzbekistan, another one of my important clients. It's 10:45, so I'm afraid I'm going to have to run. But again, I look forward to a readout from Ashley and from everybody else. And again, I appreciate so much the opportunity to come back here to SAIS. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Blake, for making time in your schedule to be here with us, and in particular for sharing those wonderful insights with us on India and on the geopolitics of Asia in general. If I could ask everyone to join with me once again just to show our appreciation to him and thanking him as he leaves and heads off to his other appointment. Thank you, Ambassador. We're going to transition now to our panel discussion. So if I could ask those who are participating on the panel, we're going to put some table tents up. So we'll take about 30-second transition here, and then we'll kick things off. I think we're off to a terrific start this morning with Ambassador Blake's remarks. It really teed up the topic for the rest of our program, our panel discussion. It was about 12 months ago, almost to the day, that we had assembled a very similar group here, right here at Johns Hopkins SAIS, to launch last year's book, Asia's Rising Power and America's Continued Purpose. This was the 10th anniversary volume that sought really to provide a big picture assessment of the major trends and issues influencing the peace and security of Asia. This net assessment really spanned the region and sought to examine several core issues affecting Asia's development. So it looked at domestic and ideological transformations. It looked at national security threats stemming from military competition, nuclear proliferation, energy and resource scarcity. It looked at demographic trends, the politics of climate change, and so on. In the end, I think the study, kind of the bottom line, concluded that over the last 30 years, the strategic landscape of the world has undergone a major transformation. and that is as the Asia-Pacific has really replaced the Atlantic as the center for global power. I think that was one of our major takeaways from last year's study. So really following on the collapse of the Soviet Union, the rise of Japan and South Korea, today the real key drivers of this ongoing shift of power from west to east are the rises of China and India. And so as the Strategic Asia Research Team, led by its fearless leader, Ashley Tellis here, contemplated the topic for the next year's book and reflected on the conclusions from last year's book, I think it was decided that the new book needed specifically to explore the rise of China and India and to assess what their growing power and influence means for Asia. So 12 months later, here we are again, and we have in our hands the resulting study of that, and that's the book we're launching today, Asia Responds to Its Rising Powers, China and India. This book explores how the key Asian states and some of the subregions are responding to the rise of China and India, and examines the strategies that these states are pursuing to preserve their national interest. So it's my pleasure to moderate this panel discussion that will be talking about this incredibly important topic today. But before I introduce our distinguished presenters, I wanted to just put in a couple of more plugs for the Strategic Asia program. First of all, in recognition of the busy lives of policymakers, we offer a condensed executive brief each year related to the book. So all of you received a complimentary copy of that. We are very proud of that small publication. It includes the executive summaries of each of the chapters. It includes the section called Strategic Asia by the Numbers, and then the full-text version of the overview chapter that Dr. Tellis authored that provides insights and highlights really the key policy implications for the United States. So despite that all of you are receiving a complimentary copy today, I still do encourage you to visit my colleagues out in the foyer and take home a full copy of the book with you. You can purchase those there in the foyer. As I said, there's a table there where folks can either give you an order form or you can purchase the book today. Second, I just wanted to come back to the database that I mentioned earlier. Again, we're really excited about the upgrade that it's gone through this year and the new interactive mapping tool. If you didn't have a chance, again, to see the demo, I encourage you to stop by and take a look at that. It's still the database is still in a beta phase, so for now we've captured data on the military forces of China and Japan only. We intend in the future to add more to map similar data for other key militaries. So we look forward to any feedback and thoughts that you all have as you have some time to explore and get to know that really wonderful and unique resource that NBR provides. So now it's my pleasure to introduce our panelists today. Each of them will plan to speak for about 8 to 10 minutes, focusing on the key research findings from their respective chapters and conclusions in the book. And then at the end of the panel, we will have some time for Q&A, and we'll hope to have an interactive discussion at that time. So we'll go in order from on my right, starting all the way down the table. So first, we have Dr. Ashley Tellis, who is a senior associate at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He is also the research director for the Strategic Asia program at NBR, a capacity he served in for the last 8 years. We are forever grateful to Ashley for his intellectual leadership. This program simply would not be the same without him. There is really no equal. To his right, we have Dr. Mike Green, who is an associate professor at the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University, as well as the Japan chair and senior advisor at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Mike brings a real wealth of both academic and practitioner experience to the book, and we're just so grateful to have him with us here today. To Dr. Green's right, we have Ambassador Teresita Schaffer. Ambassador Schaffer is a non-resident fellow at the Brookings Institution and a senior advisor to McLarty Associates here in Washington, D.C. Ambassador Schaffer was a diplomat for the United States for over 30 years, serving in Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, and as the ambassador to Sri Lanka. So thank you for being here today with us, Ambassador Schaffer. To her right, we have Rory Medcalf, who is the Director of the International Security Program at the Lowy Institute for Policy based in Sydney, Australia. And Rory, we're so thankful that you made the very, very long trip to be here with us today. And appreciate all that you bring to the table as well. And then to his right, we have our respondent today who will be commenting on these presentations. Dr. Mike Lampton, who's the Dean of Faculty and Director of the China Studies Program here at SAIS. In addition to, as he mentioned earlier, being my former boss and professor. So, Mike, the 8 to 10 minute limit does not apply to you. You're free to take as much time as you'd like and say whatever you would like today. So thanks for supporting and hosting us today, Mike. Without further ado, I'll go ahead and turn the time over to you, Ashley.
Thank you, Travis. Thank you, Travis. And I want to start by thanking NBR for sustaining this program, which has been an extremely creative effort now for almost a decade. You lose track of how long we've been in business, given that we've managed to actually produce every volume on a very tight schedule with a regularity that is actually surprises me and shocks me every time we do it. I also want to thank in a special way actually the contributors to the volume, because I have been particularly privileged over the last 8 years to have had a variety of people who have produced top-notch chapters in every iteration of the series. And for those of you who take the trouble to look at the volume more closely, you'll see that for yourself, that every one of these chapters is really a reference quality chapter. And it's something that will quite outlive just the next year when you will have a new iteration of the Strategic Asia series. But the chapters are really quite enduring. They're not written from a perspective of the here and the now, but they take into account the here and the now to really illuminate a set of trends that are more structural and long-lived. This volume, as Travis said before, really looks at how major Asian powers look at the rise of China and India. And it's not a volume that examines that question simply from the perspective of a unitary nation state. Rather, it's a volume that takes into account what in the academic trade is called 2- and 3-level games. That is, it looks at how the rise of China and India is perceived both from the context of the domestic politics of these countries and from the regional engagements that each of these countries have. So it's not simply country X looking at China and India as some sort of an inert black box, but rather how that perception of these two countries is intimately linked to issues of history, culture, domestic politics, domestic constituencies, and that makes for obviously a much richer understanding, and so I really do commend the volume for your consideration. Now, I said that the book is about how Asian powers look at the rise of China and India. The United States is obviously an Asian power. Not physically, but simply because of its enormous political presence. And my remarks in the next few minutes are really going to be focused on the United States and how the United States has sought to manage the rise in China and India. I start off with the proposition in the chapter that the rise of both these states is owed broadly to three broad variables. First, their latent integration into what is a very favorable U.S. geopolitical order. Second, the fact that each of these two countries in different ways have relatively favorable factor endowments. And third, that they have pursued, again, sensible economic policies within the limits of their own political systems and their domestic politics. The bottom line is that both these countries will exhibit relatively high levels of economic growth for some time to come. And although I am open to the idea that these countries might become truly powerful entities at a global level, I argue in the book that one must not take this outcome as either inevitable or a given, because both countries also face significant domestic constraints, and their ability to become globally dominant in a comprehensive sense will obviously depend on how they circumvent or how they surmount these domestic constraints. But the bottom line is, at least as economic engines, they are certainly going to be able to sustain growth for a long time, and certainly will do better than the rest of the international system, which is what accounts for one very important fact that drives my chapter, which is that you will continue to see the relative decline of the United States because of supernormal economic performance on the part of China and India. At the level of pure economics, this supernormal performance is a good news story, because it essentially enables both these countries to raise people out of poverty. It encourages wider economic integration around these countries, and globally it basically helps expand the international production possibility frontier, and that's basically good news. But at the level of international politics, things get a little more complicated, particularly from the viewpoint of the United States. China's growth rates in particular, which are superior than India's, have been consistently superior now for at least about 30 years, position it to, if the trend continues, overtake the United States in gross economic strength at some point in time. Now, again, this is not a given, this is not guaranteed, but if the trend holds, it is a very real possibility. And if that possibility were to occur, then of course the international system would be faced with what political scientists call a power transition. Even if it does not occur, the fact that the trend lines are likely to hold, as I argued, in purely economic terms, raises the specter of a power transition. And the specter of this power transition obviously casts a shadow on how states begin to position themselves to deal with this reality. This has two important dimensions. One is it creates a certain tension in U.S.-China relations, because China then becomes perceived as a potential competitor to the United States. And it creates a certain tension, of course, in regional relations between India and China itself, because both these countries are fast rising economic powers located on each other's peripheries. And they have a history of not an entirely congenial relationship. So you have two sets of relations that have to be managed simply because of the dramatic growth in these two countries. Now, from the perspective of the United States, what that does is that it sets up a triangular set of interactions, but a triangular interaction that is not perfectly equidistant. That is, for reasons of political competition, it sets up the United States in a set of circumstances where it views India as a potential partner in the management of China's rise. And this creates a sort of a triangular relationship that is analogous at one level to the kind of triangular relationship that we saw during the Cold War between the United States, the Soviet Union, and China, but different in a very fundamental way this time around. And the difference is accounted for the fact that even though there may be elements of political competition that pull the United States and India closer together in the face of a rising China, all three countries are increasingly tied by strong and growing bonds of economic interdependence. And it is this reality of competition amidst economic dependence that makes this iteration of the triangle very different from the triangular interactions that we saw during the Cold War. And it changes the nature of the triangular relationship in one very fundamental way. That is, although each of the three players in this relationship seek to benefit from tightened economic interdependence with the other, they also are seeking to simultaneously protect themselves from the power consequences of the other partner's growth. And it is this dynamic that really defines not simply the US-China-India relationship, but actually the behavior of every other Asian country that is explored in this volume. Every other Asian country that is the object of analysis in the volume ends up finding itself in a situation where it seeks to profit from China's rise, because there are positive externalities of China's growth, but at the same time is cautious or is concerned about what China's growth in economic power might imply for China's growth in political capacity and military capabilities. And so squaring this circle, as it were, where you want to profit from China's growth, actually you end up contributing to China's growth because of the mechanics of economics, while at the same time trying to immunize yourself from the adverse consequences of what may be asymmetrically superior growth on the part of China, is what defines the challenge for every Asian country explored in the volume. It also defines the challenge in very explicit ways for the United States. And here there is one particular dilemma, and I'm going to end on this note. The dilemma that confronts the United States in the triangular relationship between India and China is the following. The U.S. may be more concerned about the rise of China than it is about the rise of India, but the U.S. finds itself enmeshed with much deeper economic bonds with China than it is with India. And so, even though China may be the stronger object of concern, it also ends up being the partner which is, in relative terms, more important for the United States. And so the United States is trapped, in some sense, between the realities of its circumstances and the aspirations of its strategy. It may want a deep and abiding relationship with India as a way of creating objective conditions, as a way of creating favorable objective conditions that shape China's rise. But because India's own economic strategies are inward-driven rather than trade-driven, the United States ends up objectively with thinner economic ties to India in comparison to the country that it has most concerns about, which is China. And how the United States manages this dynamic, and for that matter, how India manages this dynamic, will really determine how this triangular competition finally gets shaped. I just want to make one last point. As this dilemma works itself out, I argue in the paper that the United States cannot presume that nature or the international system will simply pacify China by itself. And therefore, the U.S. has two tasks which it must pursue simultaneously. First, restore its own strength at home, which is the fundamental building block for success in everything else. And second, move with some discipline to reinvigorate the Asian alliance system in the broadest sense of the word, as the insurance that China's rise will not have adverse consequences for the United States or other powers in Asia. Thank you.
Thank you. I enjoyed working on this chapter a great deal. I actually was recruited by Rich Ellings to do the very first Japan chapter for the very first edition of the Strategic Asia volume, and had to back out because I went into the government to work in the National Security Council staff. By the way, for those of you who have lots of pending writing assignments, the best way to get out of them is to go into government. I highly recommend it. You can just drop everything, and there's not much anyone can say because it's national security. But while I was in the NSC, I was on the staff 5 years and ran Asia for several of those years. My staff and I actually read the book. Not everyone, but several did. Found it very useful. One of my director for China Affairs read the entire volume over the course of a week on the exercise bike in the White House gym because it was so refreshingly strategic. I mean, most of what's written is interesting, but this really helped you get purchase on big problems in Asia. And now that I teach at Georgetown, I use the book, as I assume many professors at SAIS do, because there are some good textbooks on international relations of East Asia, but they're usually 2, 3, 4, 6 years out of date, and this is the perfect way to provide an updated chapter. So for policy and academia, it's been an enormous contribution, and congratulations to Travis and to everyone at NBR. And thanks to Ashley for reminding me I owed a chapter, which I produced this year. This is an especially interesting approach this year because if you follow the debate in the U.S., you would tend to think that Asia is being shaped by a bipolar relationship between the U.S. and China, and it's a question of how to manage competition and cooperation and how much we have a concert of power, how much we have a balance of power. When you read this volume, I think, as Ashley suggested, you'll find that in many ways Asia is not in a bipolar situation. It's moving into a multipolar situation. And from the perspective of U.S. policy, we need to understand that multipolarity, the nature of these relationships. The Japan-China-India relationship is a strategic triangle. There are effects, but we have to be very careful not to overemphasize triangles in Asia. They're interesting. I run a U.S., Japan, India strategic dialogue at CSIS. You get insights. There are some common purposes. It's not that simple. For example, as we look at Japan, clearly the most important relationship is the U.S. That's true for India and China, too. And even within Asia, I would argue for Japan, although India is increasingly important, the relationship now that animates the Japanese, at least on the political and security side, is Australia. And the relationship that should be animating the Japanese is Korea. So India is one of a series of important relationships Japan is exploring and building in a much more complicated multipolar Asia, where the challenges faced by a rising China and the opportunities are shared by almost every party. When I was on the NSC as Senior Director for Asia, we structured the office to encompass both South Asia and East Asia. It was a heck of a lot of work for a small office in the NSC, and they have subsequently divided them up so that South Asia and East Asia are separate offices in the NSC. It obviously allows you now more focus on specific country problems, but I think what's been lost is a broader strategic focus on the equilibrium in Asia and how the India-Japan bookends, if you will, force you to think about this region in non-bipolar ways and to think about it in multipolar terms. So it forced a discipline, I thought, on our strategic approach that was good. The downside, of course, is we never went home, we never did our laundry, we never slept. The Japan chapter I wrote looks at both China and India, and in the few minutes I have, I thought I'd focus mostly on India. In a way, because how China refracts or is reflected in the Japan-India relationship is in some ways more interesting than a straight presentation on Japan-China relations, which many of you probably know well. I wrote an article with Ben Self up here in the third row about 16 years ago, arguing that Japan was not, in fact, converging with China in a new Asian order that excluded the U.S., which in many ways is a prevailing theme at the time in the mid-90s, that in fact Japan was starting to view the rise of China in ways that would lead to balancing behavior. And I wrote a book subsequently called Japan's Reluctant Realism. I was not arguing that Japan would become realistic. I was not arguing that Japan would remilitarize. I was arguing that Japan would exhibit more balancing behavior. Much of that in what theorists call external balancing, which is exploring relationships not only with the core ally, the United States, but other powers in Asia to maintain a favorable strategic equilibrium as China rises. And I think the India story has largely borne that out, although not without some bumps in the road. Japan, like every other country, has this awkward, including us, this awkward situation where the economic relationship with China is out of sync with the security relationship. Seikei Bunri, the divergence of political and economic relations with China, has been a phrase in Japanese media for 15, 20 years. It's the reality. But Japan has moved in many ways on the foreign policy side and increasingly on the economic side to hedge against uncertainty about China. It began with us, with the United States, in the 90s with the Nye Initiative and other efforts to upgrade the alliance. India was a natural partner for Japan viewed objectively. I don't know if Satu Lamay is here. Satu Lamay from the East-West Center had a great article in the late 90s called of Sushi and Samosa. And his argument was that while structurally Japan and India have natural reasons to align, the cultures are as different as sushi and samosa. Both delightful, but you wouldn't eat them on the same plate. And so there were some sort of sticky cultural and historical issues that got in the way of the relationship, particularly in '98 after India's nuclear test, when Japan came down harder because of its own nuclear history than any other country in the West. So there is this historical problem. To the extent there were close ties between Japan and India throughout the Cold War, they were mostly on the right, in some ways the far right. So you had these odd bedfellow relationships like George Fernandez the defense minister, and Ishihara Shintaro, the right-wing governor of Tokyo, both of whom agreed that the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal was a travesty, that Japan did nothing wrong, that it was right to liberate Asia from the West, and so on and so forth. It was a narrative that obviously played extremely well with the post-colonial thinking on the right in India, and played extremely well with the right wing in Japan. But it wasn't enough to build a relationship, an enduring strategic relationship. That started to change in around 2000, in some ways because the right in Japan became ascendant with the demise of the Tanaka faction and the center in Japanese politics. In large part, it reflected breakthroughs the Bush administration made, and in particular the U.S.-India nuclear agreement, which forced on the Koizumi government a decision. Were they going to back their ally and take advantage of this new strategic opportunity by supporting the U.S.-India agreement in the IAEA and the Nuclear Suppliers Group, or were they going to stick to traditional anti-nuclear traditions in Japan? They chose to go with India and have consistently done so since. Then the India card was played by Japan when the East Asia Summit was created. The Chinese were throwing their weight around. They were using smaller client states in Southeast Asia to argue for an East Asia Summit that would be detached from ASEAN, that would be driven by the hosts, Malaysia, then Beijing. Japan, Singapore, and Indonesia conspired to bring in Australia, New Zealand, and India. So the India card became important in regional architecture. In 2008, following an agreement the year earlier with Australia, Japan signed only its third security agreement with the first, obviously, the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty, this time with India in 2008. And the security relationship in terms of exchanges and defense exercises has moved forward pretty smartly since then. And then on the economic side, Japanese industry began getting nervous about the China market. They'd largely saturated the China market. And surveys by the Japan Bank for International Cooperation began suggesting in around 2000, 2001 that Japanese industry, when they surveyed CEOs, wanted a strategy that was called China Plus One. They wanted to start hedging their investment by putting more in countries that had better rule of law, that were democratic, that didn't have political problems, and so that meant India, Vietnam to some extent, Malaysia, but especially India. India became the largest recipient of Japanese overseas development assistance, of yen loans. Japan's the major investor in the Mumbai-Delhi corridor. And so the economic relationship began moving forward, including with an economic partnership agreement. Now, there were bumps along the way. These same surveys show that Japanese CEOs are extremely frustrated with the Indian market. All you need to do is take a flight from Narita to Delhi to go from, and I love both countries, but to go from the sort of orderly, pristine, robot sushi delivering Narita airport and then get off in Delhi and walk out and try to get a cab.
They've got a new airport.
They do have a new airport. Signs of progress. But in the period from 2000 to 2008, you can imagine your average Japanese business executive getting hit by that wave of dust and thinking, how are we going to do this? But they've persevered. And particularly trading companies, energy companies are interested. One big driver has been interest in Japan in nuclear exports. In order to grow the economy, the Japanese government has developed a strategy for exports of infrastructure funded by the Japan Bank for International Cooperation. You may have heard they're trying to sell the bullet train or maglev to go from Baltimore to Washington. And frankly, we're not a good market for that politically right now. But they've also been working on exports of nuclear power and have had some initial success in countries very interested in India. The Japanese government had a big showdown on whether or not to negotiate a 1-2-3 agreement with Delhi. And the non-proliferationists and idealists went to Foreign Minister Okada, not of the LDP, but of the new DPJ, who had a strong record on non-proliferation and denuclearization. And they thought he would back them, but he didn't. He backed the Foreign Policy Bureau, he backed the Trade Ministry, and he signed off on negotiating a peaceful cooperation agreement with India, because it's about jobs. Okada's not stupid, and it's about strategy. That one would have thought that the DPJ would be a bump in the road. We certainly had difficulties in the United States managing the alliance and the transition to the Democratic Party of Japan. Not so India. Hatoyama, for all of his loopiness and flip-flopping on Futenma and other issues in the U.S.-Japan alliance, was rock steady on India and moved forward, not only implemented previous LDP agreements with India, but signed new agreements. And it is now I think what makes this a sustainable thing is there's now bipartisan buy-in about the importance of the India relationship. There will be continued problems. As Ashley says, economically, China will, by an order of magnitude, be more important to Japan economically. There are constant political problems in Japan. I don't need to go into the details. Suffice it to say, we'll probably have another prime minister in a year. In India, there are also political problems. Both of these are countries with two major parties, neither of which has been able to get a majority. And so they are coalition governments and therefore inherently unstable and a little quirky. And within India, there's still a residual non-aligned mentality that gets a little anxious, particularly in the Ministry of External Affairs, about alignment, even with an Asian country, to uphold, because this is the net effect of this, the American neoliberal order. So there's going to be a lot of two steps forward, one step back. But I think this is now a feature of Japan's playbook, and it tells you a lot about the Japanese strategic view of China, which is complicated. There are different views. There are big debates. But the fact that India is now, I think, broadly recognized in both Japanese parties as a card that they've got to play to keep their weight up gives you some flavor about how this multipolarity, especially below the U.S.-China veneer, is playing out and how important it is to our own interests and to our practice of strategy and diplomacy in the region.
Well, thank you, Ashley. Thank you, Travis. Thank you, SAIS and NBR. I have a very different set of countries to talk about. The assignment that Ashley gave me was to look at how the rest of South Asia looks at the rise of India and China. I'm going to do that, but I'm also going to say two words about the Indian perspective because Harsh Pant, who wrote an excellent chapter on India, isn't here to defend himself. The view from the rest of South Asia is very different from what Mike sketched out. For the rest of South Asia, India is the immediate neighbor and the big power they have to deal with in their foreign policy. China is over the horizon, but an increasingly important presence. I'm going to talk about really three categories of countries. There's a fourth one that I deal with in the chapter, which is the teeny-weeny countries, Bhutan and Maldives. Interesting, I recommend it, but I'm not going to take the time this morning. The first is a country that's in a category by itself, and that's Pakistan. Pakistan's entire strategic concept is centered on India. India as the existential threat, the United States as the unfaithful friend, and China as the all-weather friend. Now, as a result of this, from Pakistan's perspective, China's rise is a strategic bonanza, and India's rise is a strategic threat. The Pakistanis' view of China as the all-weather friendship involves a certain amount of putting gold paint on history because there were a number of crises in Pakistan's life where China didn't step in to rescue it. But this is the way they look at the world. The rise of China is, above all, I think, for Pakistan, an opportunity to reduce their dependence on the United States. And that is particularly acute at the moment. You may have noticed that during the past 9 months, when U.S.-Pakistan relations have been in full-blown crisis with repeated accelerators to the crisis, there's been an enormous amount of VIP traffic between Islamabad and Beijing, the most recent being high-level visitors from China showing up to say publicly and privately how steady they were, and gosh, it's too bad the Americans are being so difficult. The rise of India, as I said, strategic disaster, made worse from Pakistan's point of view by the fact that India and the United States now have a significant relationship. India and Pakistan have always looked over their shoulders at what the United States was doing with the other. The United States has tried to get out from under that pairing. The phrase we used was dehyphenation, but the hyphenators, I'm happy to tell you, are still alive and well and living, particularly in Islamabad, also in Delhi. But the idea that the United States, which was supposed to be at the outset one of the balancers that Pakistan enlisted to reduce the disparity between itself and India, is now closely connected with India, is a big problem. The prime issue for Pakistan now, of course, is Afghanistan, seen through the prism of India, seen from Islamabad. Afghanistan is an opportunity for India to conduct a grand pincer movement with Pakistan in the middle. And Afghanistan is also shaping Pakistan's relationship with the United States. And if you're looking for evidence, I offer you Admiral Mullen's testimony before the Armed Services Committee earlier this week, in which he publicly, officially, and formally accused the Pakistan Intelligence Service of using the organization that carried out the attack on the U.S. Embassy in Kabul as a virtual arm. The strategic goals between the U.S. and Pakistan don't match up in Afghanistan, which is the fundamental problem we have. Pakistan's strategic goals also don't match China's goals in Afghanistan, because one of the issues for China, of course, is Islamic extremism. But China clearly finds Pakistan useful enough that they're prepared to be the big, steady player. A question that's often asked is China likely to step in if the U.S. and Pakistan come to what some have called a third divorce? The answer is yes and no. Yes, politically, but no financially. The Chinese don't do big money dumps. And probably also no from the point of view of military supply, where the Chinese will supply quantity, but they don't have the kind of high-end equipment that the Pakistanis are interested in. Second category of countries is another one-country category, and that's Afghanistan. Afghanistan doesn't really control its own strategic environment. It has been, for the extended time that it's been at war, to some extent at the mercy of key outside players, the Russians in the 1980s, today mostly Pakistan and the United States. But Afghanistan has a long history of hedging its bets with Pakistan by cultivating India and vice versa. And the relationship with India has in fact been historically by far the most comfortable of those two. So clearly, if Afghanistan reaches a level of stability where it's able to play cards in the foreign policy arena, hedging is going to be the name of the game, and they would be only too happy to bring China into this calculation as well. This is something that comes naturally in Afghan internal politics, and in that sense will also come naturally if they're able to play the foreign policy game at some happier point in their future. The other three countries, Nepal, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka, all have somewhat different foreign policy drivers. But in every case, the rise of India is both an opportunity and a danger. The rise of China increases their ability to hedge against India's predominance. I'll go quickly through some of the specifics because it gives you something of a picture of how China has related to countries in the subcontinent. The U.S. is part of the calculus in all three of these countries, but not to the same intimate extent that it is in Pakistan. Nepal, sometimes Nepalis describe their country as a yam between two boulders, India and China. Historically and still, India is by far the more important player in Nepal. But China has become more important both for economic reasons and because of the prominence of the Maoist insurgency, which has torn that country apart for the past 10, 15 years. Nepal is really shaped by isolation. That has been the dominant influence on its modern history. And its main current drama is internal. But the significance of the rise of India and China is going to be that both will be jockeying for position in Nepal, and that India has to worry about this in ways that it didn't used to. In Bangladesh, China and the United States have both, to some degree, been balancers of India. India, having been part of a very important part of how Bangladesh became independent in the first place, has now become the big next-door neighbor that everyone loves to beat up on, particularly the party that is now in the opposition. It is primarily an economic presence in Bangladesh, looked on with considerable mistrust by India. That's not new. But looked on as an opportunity, I would say, by both of the parties that have alternated in running the Bangladeshi government for the past 20 years. Sri Lanka, in a way, is the most interesting story because China versus the U.S. in Sri Lanka goes back to the 1950s when the United States actually cut off aid to Sri Lanka because they engaged in trade with China. And the trade in which they engaged was a swap deal, Sri Lankan rubber for Chinese rice, meeting a serious rice deficit in this rice-eating country and providing rubber for Chinese industry. So there's always been this leitmotif of big relationship with China, in part as a way to thumb nose against the United States. At the same time, Sri Lanka was the first country, it may still be the only one, in which the United States and China both provided military assistance to a sitting government facing the same insurgency in 1971. It was an insurgency that has had 3 lives. Its present life is not as an insurgency, but as a political party. But that's an interesting twist to the U.S.-China Sri Lanka story. The more important part of the U.S.-Sri Lanka China-India story, however, is what happened when the Sri Lankans won their war against the Tamil Tigers, the liberation tigers of Tamil Eelam. In May 2009, the Sri Lankan government announced that it had won the war and that the entire leadership of the LTTE had been killed in the process. This was a war that I think it's fair to say nobody except the Sri Lankan generals thought they could win, that the Western donors had uniformly, and I'm including Australia in the West even though you live in the East, at least east of us, the Western donors had uniformly urged them not to try, and they won it. So, no surprise that the reaction was, you told us we couldn't do it, you told us not to try, you can go jump in the lake. And it wasn't a whole lot more polite than that. India and China, on the other hand, rushed in with generous aid in both cases, and a message which in India's case I think was not specifically aimed against the United States, was trying to make up for over 20 years of basically India being frozen out of Sri Lanka on account of some developments that had taken place earlier. So that India and China became the first cards the Sri Lankan government played in an effort to demonstrate to the West that they don't really need us that much anymore. Now, as Bob Blake will tell you, they, in fact, don't want to break off ties with the United States and the West. There are important economic reasons not to do that. But politically, this government very much wants to show that it can set its own course, and if the Western donors don't like it, they can lump it. And the big plays have been India and China. So for Sri Lanka, uniquely, they are using the rise of both of these countries as at least a tactical, if not a strategic opportunity. Let me try to pull all this disparate stuff together. First of all, there's some common threads in the things that have happened in the past 2 decades. First, India is much more welcoming of the U.S. presence in the rest of South Asia and in the Indian Ocean than was the case before 1990. This is a reflection of the revolutionary transformation of U.S.-Indian ties and of the fact that the strongest element in the U.S.-India strategic dialogue, small s, small d, is actually between the two navies and centers on the Indian Ocean. Second common point, the India-China rivalry itself is the subject of some ambivalence, particularly in India, and I think some of this may be true in China as well. On the one hand, the Indian government and the Indian policy-aware public is very sensitive to any suggestion that China is jerking them around, which it has, in point of fact, been doing for the past couple of years. And this tends to draw India closer to the United States. And I offer you as an example the Indian reaction after the U.S. pushed back on China's claims about the South China Seas. At the same time, India and China have very much deepened their economic relationship. China is the largest trading partner for goods trade with India. The United States is still the largest if you throw in services and the electronic world. The third big change in the last 20 years is potentially, I think, the most significant if you're looking at the longer-term future, and that is the very much higher Chinese profile in the rest of South Asia, and particularly on the economic side. China's ties with India were trivial as recently as 5 or 6 years ago. You can make that same statement about the rest of South Asia, but for an even shorter time period. China is now one of the top 4 trading partners of all of the South Asian countries. It is a significant source of aid. Now, China does aid differently from the way the United States does. It tends to do infrastructure. It tends to do loans. We mostly do rural development and grassrootsy stuff, and we do grants. But it puts China very much in the economic game in a lot of different ways. It's also a significant military supplier in a number of countries. It supplies less exotic equipment than what the United States does, but also a lot less expensive. So moving from that to the outlook, I see the Indian Ocean becoming a more contested strategic space, with China as a more regular presence there. I see the rest of South Asia becoming, I don't like to say contested strategic space because I don't see this as a grand geopolitical struggle for the heart and soul of Sri Lanka. But I do see the Chinese relationships there becoming more consequential in more different ways, therefore raising for India the question of whether they can, of how to sustain primacy in the region where they really care about doing that. Secondly, this goes beyond the scope of my chapter, but I think it's well within the ambit of what the book was talking about. India is now, quite belatedly, but nonetheless, working hard to become a much more significant player in East Asia. Mike has talked about the Japan dimension. India now has free trade agreements with Japan, Korea, and ASEAN. Anybody like me who worked on trade issues in the U.S. government finds it remarkable that the issue free trade, the words free trade area could ever cross the lips of a senior Indian government official. This is happening, and it's going to happen more. Finally, the wild cards. And the wild card basically is the United States. How does the United States deal with its exit from Afghanistan? How do U.S. relations with China and India develop? And perhaps more importantly than either of those, what happens in the U.S. domestic economy, which will affect not only how we are able to afford our foreign policy, but also how other countries look at us in a game that is still heavily leaning towards hedging and balancing.
Thanks. Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Yeah. Thanks very much, Ashley, for having me here. And I think Teresita is a hard act to follow because I have only one country to cover, but it's a surprisingly complex and interesting one on this topic. Might I borrow your watch? Sure. Thank you. I'm talking about Australia's future between China and India today, and I've titled my chapter Grand Stakes because Australia has a lot at stake in these relationships. Now, I've argued that in the chapter that a dynamic Indo-Pacific Asia, as we're seeing, in which China and India loom large, is going to be very good for Australia in many ways. The region, the massive resource demand that's fueling Australia's economy to a large extent from the rise of India and China explains why Australia has been largely insulated from a lot of the economic woes we've seen throughout the world recently. China and India are also becoming primary sources of the human capital that's making Australia, which is very much a migrant society, really hum along as a society and an economy. But the future is certainly not bright in every dimension, and there are some strategic worries emerging that my chapter looks at. At the most basic level, for the first time in the history of my country, a middle-sized democracy, the southern edge of maritime Asia, we're confronted by, if you like, the simultaneous rise of two Asian great powers. Now, this is giving rise to new tensions, I think, in Australian policymaking involving our economic and security interests, but also our values as a nation. Now, a couple of years ago, China overtook Japan to become Australia's top trading partner. It's the first time this status has been held by a state that is not Canberra's security guarantor or that ally's ally, and that doesn't necessarily share Australia's liberal democratic values. So the potential for a contested Asia in which China and India loom large poses, I think, critical new challenges for Australia's security, which, as many of you know, has long been reliant on an open and stable regional order unwritten by US dominance. For the moment, Australia is enjoying the best of both worlds. Massive markets for our abundant mineral and energy resources and so forth, while US power underwrites our security. But there are questions emerging about how long these good times can last and whether Australia actually has a strategy for an era of Chinese and Indian strength. There are choices, I think, ahead for Canberra. We often hear about potential choices between the US and China, but there is a more complex dynamic at work. And I think it's not a simple bipolar Asia or global order we're talking about. And the weight and influence of India is going to become an increasing factor for Australia. A few quick numbers. China at the moment buys about a quarter of Australia's exports, a quarter of Australia's total exports in a trade relationship that's worth about $100 billion a year and is growing. There are deepening links between Australia and China through business, migration, education, tourism across the board. But resource trade dominates. Now, Australia is the world's largest exporter of iron ore, and China imports a staggering 70% of that. China's on track to become Australia's largest source of tourists. There are more Chinese students in Australia than there are in this country, and the Chinese and Indian communities are the biggest and fastest growing migrant communities in Australia, other than Britain and New Zealand. And you can argue whether New Zealand is a migrant community in Australia or not. Overall, the starkest questions are at the strategic level for us, for Australia. Now, they revolve at one level around whether or how Australia's alliance with the United States might one day be invoked in a possible military confrontation with China. But more broadly, there are questions emerging about whether Australia might differ with the US or others and how far it's willing to see Chinese power and Chinese interest accommodated in the regional order. Interestingly, Australia's recent reaffirmation of the alliance and really deepening of the alliance, there's talk of increased US military access in Australia, for example, suggests that we're not going to see a divergence between Australia and the United States on these issues in the near term. For the moment, at the same time, Australians don't want confrontation with China. My institute, the Lowy Institute in Sydney, has done opinion polling that has shown relatively high comfort levels with Chinese power and influence in Asia. But that is changing. Interestingly, in the last few years, we've seen Australian public opinion turning against or becoming more nervous about Chinese power in many ways. You can explain this on a number of levels. There's obviously uncertainty in Australia about Chinese assertiveness, military modernisation. There's been a very rocky bilateral relationship between Australia and China, peculiarly under the then Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd, the Western world's first Chinese-speaking leader. Australia and China had some weirdly rocky times. Differences over Chinese state-owned investment in Australia, Australian defence policy, China's treatment of dissent and so forth. I think for many Australians, a turning point in perceptions of China came in 2008 with the Olympic torch relay. The sight of 10,000 Chinese demonstrators in Canberra, a supposedly spontaneous demonstration in a very small town, really drowning out human rights protesters, I think made quite an impact on Australian public opinion, and not a good one. The bilateral relationship has returned to a steadier course, informed by the sort of mutual respect, or at least public mutual respect, that was sustained under the previous Prime Minister John Howard. But there are questions about how long we can sustain this as Chinese power grows. Now, a few brief words, or a few, I guess, more than brief words on India, because the rise of India makes the region's power dynamics not only more complicated, but I would argue more beneficial for Australia. India has become Australia's third or fourth largest export market, again depending how you measure it or when you measure it. India is rapidly overtaking South Korea to be our third largest export market. In time it has even the potential to overtake Japan, I believe, in that regard. So, India is beginning to not match China in Australia's economic horizons, but certainly become a third or fourth most important player by an order of magnitude. India buys half Australia's gold, 15% of our coal, and of course Australia, for our sins, remains the world's largest coal exporter. And there's a lot of growth ahead. India's energy security, I think, is going to be increasingly tied to Australia. Coal, natural gas, and I think eventually uranium as well. And Canberra is seeking to complement these economic and energy ties with a security partnership with India. There's been some strange frustrations here that you may not be fully aware of between Australia and India, and not the same frustrations, I should add, that the US and India have experienced, despite shared values and security interests. There's been a pretty ugly mix of I think, misperceptions and policy mistakes in the relationship, which have, I guess, suggested that two democracies don't always get it right. Differences over Australia's, or the Australian Labor government's continuing refusal to supply uranium to India for civil purposes. Mutual misperception about each other's China policies, an interesting issue we can go into if we have time later. And the experience of Indian students in Australia hasn't always been positive. There's been some very bad fallout from the bad experiences of some Indian students in Australia in an industry, I guess, that grew too far too fast. Now, even if Australia, or when Australia lifts its uranium ban to India, as I think will happen, it's still going to be a complex relationship. Two democracies can misread each other pretty well. The Indian media rarely helps on this front. And I would argue that one of our challenges is at the moment, I think more Australians understand China than understand India, and that I think is going to have to change. To move towards a conclusion here, there are some interesting parallels and contrasts between the way Australia is responding to the rise of China and India. There's economic enmeshment in both relationships. I think skilled labour and migration from both countries is going to become increasingly important. A few decades from now, Australia will in many ways partly wear a Chinese or an Indian face as a nation, both, in fact. Yet there's some very clear qualitative differences emerging as well, especially on security and values-based issues. It's conceivable that one day Australia will have to make some hard choices between China and India, as well as possible choices between China and the US, although, as I'd argue, our fundamental security choices between China and the US have already been made. Now, just to conclude, does Australia have a strategy for dealing with all of this? Many Australian analysts argue that we don't. I'd argue that the rudiments of a strategy are becoming clear. Australia's responses are driven by a mix of economic, security and values-based drivers, which sometimes reinforce, sometimes cut across each other, but there is a logic underneath. It's a hybrid response to the region's changing dynamics. Economic, security, diplomatic and societal enmeshment with the rising powers and with other Asian nations. I'm glad we've heard a bit about Japan here today. I'd also mention Indonesia and South Korea, combined with a hedging strategy that I think Australia is developing against the unknown ways Chinese power might be used in the future. 3 elements to the hedging strategy quickly. Increasing Australia's own strategic weight, at least the aspiration is there, if not always fulfilled in the implementation. Increasing Australia's defence capabilities. Secondly, reaffirming the alliance with the United States. And thirdly, improving partnerships with a range of Asian countries, including India. I think India is quite an important part of that. Does all of this make for an effective strategy? It will depend if it's sustained and enacted cleverly, but I think Australia is capable of a strategic response if it can play to its strengths. There are ways that a smaller or middle power, as some Australians like to say, can have leverage over much larger powers. Some of those ways, it's worth bearing in mind that resource dependence or economic interdependence can work both ways, and I think we're seeing in Australia that even at times of tension in the Australia-China relationship, China rates stability of supply from Australia pretty highly, more highly than political respect. I think India is becoming increasingly aware of the value it gains from, again, security of supply of resources and energy from Australia. I think strong partnerships with a range of countries in the region, security and diplomatic partnerships, help insulate Australia against problems in these big power relationships. But the alliance remains quite a vital part of this architecture. I think the alliance with the United States actually is helping Australia, certainly in its relations with India and in some ways with China. Finally, because I am speaking here in Washington DC, what does it mean for the United States? I think there's an opportunity, and that is to some extent being seized, for the US to really reinvigorate the alliance with Australia in this changing era. The alliance has to be embedded in, I think, coordination with Australia on a range of responses to the rise of China and India, involving other countries as well, whether in minilateral or regional multilateral institutions. Next, I think the United States needs to be really acutely aware of the differences in Australia's response to the rise of China and India, as well as the similarities. Australia and the US are not always going to see these relationships the same way. And finally, as I think Ashley pointed out at the beginning, we're looking within nations, we're looking within societies in this book. And I think the US needs to understand the complex ways in which Australia, beyond its policy elites, is engaging with China and India, because there are some cross-cutting tensions involving business lobbies, security establishment, public opinion, political players. There's a strong Greens party in Australia who doesn't seem to want good relations with any major power, and growing Chinese and Indian communities in Australia. All of this is going to make for quite a complex future. Thank you.
Well, let me just start by saying I think this is a terrific project, we've had a terrific discussion here today, and I generally find myself in agreement. My remarks are going to focus on where I see a few lacunae, maybe interject a bit of the Chinese perspective on this whole discussion, at least as I would understand it. I thought Ashley's overview chapter and his remarks here this morning were extremely deep and perceptive, and I really agree that we have this fundamental strategic challenge, and the we is almost everybody in the Asia-Pacific area, of trying to balance the big pluses of Chinese growth with the security apprehensions that I think, to various extent, almost everybody in the region feels. I thought Ambassador Schaffer's remarks were really excellent in pointing out, at least in part of this region, India is a very big consideration, and not everybody's totally China-focused. And I very much appreciated Rory's remarks reminding us that multipolarization in this area is a reality. Just on Australia, I remember one of more memorable interviews I had there when I was working on a book was a big shipping magnate, and he said, with respect to China, our continent is getting hauled off 40-foot container by 40-foot container to China on the resource front. So I detected an ambivalence very deep there. I'd like to make 3 points, not because I disagree with what's been said, but because I think maybe it'll help, at least from my point of view, put in a little bit of ballast in the discussion. First of all, I'd like to just briefly discuss about how the United States should situate China and India in our overall strategic thinking. Secondly, I'd like to talk about, in a very sort of analytic way, the assumption is we have a lot of common interests with India, and I certainly subscribe to that. But we have some differences with India that I think at least might get flagged as well. And finally, I'd like to ask what I think is a strategic question: how much added deterrence, let us say, of China do we get by an offshore balancing strategy that's very clearly articulated? Or put another way, at what point does offshore balancing and hedging, which has been used, become counterproductive? I don't have the answer to that, but I do believe there is such a point. Now, first, where should, from my point of view, India and China fit in overall American strategic thinking? And let me just sort of telegraph what I guess where I would start. I think the principal threat the United States faces is its economic set of problems that bear on our comprehensive national power. That's the key issue, and we ought, in my view everything from the point of view of how we can focus on really domestic revitalization in all of its senses. Certainly a balance in Asia in which we have a multipolar situation where we have to expend, let us say, less of our national treasure, relatively speaking, than would otherwise be the case. That fits very much, it seems to me, in our a national interest. We don't want to drive this hedging and balancing so far that we produce the kind of polarization and militarization that we fear. So what we're talking about here, not carried too far, I see as profoundly in our interest. I just worry that we're not capable of subtlety for very long, is quite frankly my worry there. Second set of issues is when we look at our interests with India, it's easy to get captured with the idea that we're the two world's largest democracies and so forth, and I subscribe to all of that. But let's tick off some areas where we have somewhat different policies or behavior driven by different circumstances. And I'm not particularly criticizing India, I'm just recognizing it's located in a different strategic circumstance than we are. Certainly I think India and China are competing in some sense for the favors of Myanmar. And just because India is a democracy doesn't mean in all its relationships it's necessarily doing what we would prefer on a human rights or other dimensions. If we look at India and Iran for India represents a lot of energy interests, strategic interests in Central Asia, and I don't think India is necessarily going to be singing from the American playbook or anybody else's playbook with respect to Iran. If you take the Indian nuclear test, I really don't need to say that wasn't exactly what our policy at the time would have liked. I guess unlike, I'd welcome a dialogue with Mike Green, but I would say the 2006 nuclear agreement with India was at least a mixed bag from my point of view. It's substantially in our relationships, our non-proliferation objectives around the world didn't make it easier in many respects, certainly with respect to dealing with China and China's dealings with Pakistan, about which I am deeply troubled. So in any case, that nuclear agreement with India at least seems to have two sides of that coin, and not all of them are positive. With respect to trade, it's been mentioned in general terms, but let me, U.S.-India trade I looked at the latest figures yesterday in preparing for this. We need to recognize that India's imports of American goods are about 1/5 of China's. China's our most rapidly growing major export market and has been for about at least 10 years. I'm sorry?
That's actually a sharp increase. It used to be about 1/9.
Yeah, I know. But I was being conservative on the argument. It used to be almost 10-1, and then it dropped in the last year to 5-1. Incidentally, in the same year that India's deficit, or our deficit with India went up about 100%, just in round numbers, our deficit with China dropped by $50 billion. Now, I don't think that situation's going to persist either. Very fluid. But the point is, we have a lot of structural trade problems if you're worried about deficits with India as we do with China. Also, if you start talking about foreign direct investment and open economy, certainly China's been a relatively open economy with all the problems we know about. And I would just say, finally, I think India has a very strong resistance to being used as a strategic club, if you put it that crudely, against the impulse for an autonomous foreign policy in India is very great, deservedly so. I'm not criticizing it, but we have to be careful that we don't create a wrong impression in India, not to mention China itself. Finally, I guess I would point to the final issue that I want to deal with is how much added deterrence, if that's the way, I'm putting things kind of telegraphically, but how much added deterrence do we get from China? At what point does this balancing and hedging become counterproductive? Well, first of all, I think we have to obviously take into account Chinese history and culture, and they are super sensitive to the idea that the region, its periphery, is ganging up on it. So there is going to be a point, I can guarantee you, where this becomes counterproductive. Also, I think much of our balancing and anxiety about China stemmed from 2008 and 9 Chinese foreign policy, which I would broadly say was the least skillful period in the last 30 years I've seen of Chinese foreign policy. I think the Chinese now understand that and are at least trying to correct it rhetorically. We'll see if, in fact, their behavior matches that. But I think they are going back towards what I'd call a policy of at least greater reassurance. That doesn't mean all the PLA activity is matching the desire of the diplomats. But in any case, I wouldn't necessarily at this point overreact to a very unskillful period and think that is the future. At least it ought to be a question mark. Secondly, it seems to me that India is going to play a balancing role and has a very strong set of concerns about China, and nobody needs to tell them how to behave, and we're going to get the same behavior out of India pretty much whatever happens. So I don't think we need to take on ourselves the onus of a strategy that's almost self-implementing in that sense in any case. Thirdly, there was some discussion in the overview volume, and I assume the whole volume, which I haven't had the chance to read, about the 1962 war and India's perilous, what I would characterize, particularly in, I guess, in the overview you mentioned, there was an analogy with 62. I mean, since then, India's a nuclear power. I mean, that's one big difference over 1962. I just don't see India's security situation, conceding there is still a territorial problem, as perilous as I think I got the impression at least some in the volume do. And finally, China was just mentioned with respect to all the trade growing with everybody in the region. China is so enmeshed economically there. The last thing China wants to do is jeopardize all of these relationships. Now, that doesn't mean the Chinese won't stumble into having accomplished that, or some dynamic in China could produce that. But every economic incentive China has is to, in a sense, reassure and be at least a minimally responsible member of these global production chains and regional production chains. So my point is, China's got plenty of deterrence there without the U.S. seeming to have to sign on to some conscious orchestration, because I think people are going to behave in their own self-interest in ways that accomplish that. So I guess bottom line is, I think this volume is excellent at pointing to the problem. I think it's excellent in pointing to all of the diversity within the region, and I would just say, be careful. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you to each of our presenters today, to each of the 4 book chapter authors. Thank you for your wonderful contributions to the new volume and your presentations today, and the insight that you shared with us and expertise. And then Professor Lampton, thank you very much for your insightful critique and these very thought-provoking questions that you've left us with. This will really help as we continue this discussion and proceed with caution, as you've advised. Ask everyone maybe to join me now in thanking our presenters for the great job they've done. We do have some time to open up for questions, so we have a couple of roaming microphones on the side, but I might open it first up to the panel. If anyone's interested in responding first to Professor Lampton's comments, and then we can look to see if there are some questions.
Sure.
Kazi?
I would like to respond to 2 things that Mike Lampton said. One was India-U.S. differences, and the second, more interesting question is, can the U.S. sustain subtlety? The specific issues that he mentioned as U.S.-Indian differences, either current or historic, there's no argument about. We have different perspectives on Myanmar, we have different perspectives on Iran, and certainly the nuclear issue broke a lot of crockery. On trade, actually, the figure you cited is an astonishing change in the much grimmer picture that used to go on. The really important thing, though, because those are going to be there. India's a big country. It's got its own, not just its own sense of self, but its own interest, and you can't have a relationship with a big country in which everything aligns. I think the big challenge for U.S.-India relations is that we have such different foreign policy styles, and our perspective on partners is that they ought to be junior partners, a perspective that India doesn't share. India's perspective is that everything is subservient to the goal of what they refer to as strategic autonomy. And that is what you much more politely termed as India's resistance to being used as a card in anybody else's game. The challenge that we face is going to be trying to figure out how to make those things fit together, and this is going to be an ongoing thing. Can the U.S. sustain subtlety? That is a challenge, and it is particularly a challenge in a world of congressional hearings. But I would suggest to you that we've actually done pretty well in that department, and I think that the way that the United States has and hasn't publicly dealt with its relations with India and its relations with China is a pretty good example. It is true that one of the many factors that pushed us towards expanding the relationship with India was a desire to have a larger network in South and East Asia into which China's rising power would grow. But we have avoided, like the plague, saying anything like that. It's really only in the past year or two that we have showed a little bit of ankle, and it's not the whole ankle even. So, maybe it's not so bad.
Mike put a lot on the table worth thinking about, and I think that the essence of his comments was something we will be debating and grappling with in Washington for a decade at least. Ditto for Canberra, Tokyo, Delhi, every one of Beijing's neighbors, and that is how much deterrence, how much strategic balance, how much external balancing is enough, how much is too much. And we're never going to have an agreement. This is going to be a constant tension not between Republicans and Democrats, within both parties, and within both, ALP and Liberal in Australia. I was in Australia last month, and Malcolm Turnbull and Tony Abbott couldn't have more different views of China. So this is going to be a constant debate. Theory is not so useful. It can frame the question. It doesn't give us an answer. We're not going to know how much deterrence is enough and how much is too much. I would make one self-serving point, though, which is in the Bush administration, we were quite open about our emphasis on the alliance with Japan and the transformation of our relationship with India. And Ashley and I each owned a piece of that. And I think by most people's measure, once we got over the EP3 incident, the U.S.-China relationship was more stable in that period than it was in 2009, 2010. I'm not saying that 2009 and 10 was all the Obama administration's point, but I would use that as an argument to say we shouldn't be too shy about thinking strategically. The other point I'd make is, perhaps the one area where I do disagree with Mike, I do not think that India or Japan or other countries' China's strategy is I forgot what you call it, Mike, self-regulating or self-driven, self-implementing. I think the signals from Washington are critical. We are the biggest variable in how each of these countries thinks about their own willingness to stand up to Beijing or not stand up to Beijing on issues of concern. And I think that in some ways the Obama administration unintentionally in the first year in office sent signals to India that had an impact on how India thinks about its own strategic ability to continue its hedging and engagement strategy with China. It's not just that it affects the calculation of risks because we are a big variable for them. It also influences the domestic debate within these countries, which is very similar to what we have here. So I think that we won't be able to enlist India or Japan or anyone to contain China, but I do think our declaratory policy and our actions are a major factor in how those countries debate and decide on their China policy. That means we have to get it right. I guess at the end of the day, that means we have to get it right. If we ask, I'll end with this. I'll give you one example of when we overdid it in the Bush administration, although I personally was not responsible. We went to the Koreans quietly, privately, and said, we need strategic flexibility. We need you to give us the flexibility to use forces on the peninsula for scenarios anywhere in Asia. Wink, wink, nod, nod. It was a private meeting, and then the Korean Blue House immediately leaked it. And the strategics, we were, in effect, the Pentagon wanted a perfect guarantee for contingencies. The net effect of it leaking was that in Beijing it was seen as weakness in the U.S.-Korea alliance. So I think there's a danger of us overplaying our hand or over-asking, but I do think we have an impact, a big impact. Yeah.
I want to make 3 points to Mike. The first is, Mike Lampton, I really enjoyed your comments and they were spot on. The first point I'd make is that I agree with you completely that the only thing that is within the U.S. capacity to shape is our own internal strength and our own internal restoration. And that whatever else happens in Asia, we ought to concentrate on that because it is within our power to do so. And as Mike Green pointed out, there are positive externalities that come from the restoration of American strength. So even if the rest of our policy is less than adequate, it can be compensated simply by the fact that we have capacity. So we are in complete agreement there. The second point I want to make, which goes, I think, to the heart of your critique, is this. The problem we have is that economic interdependence, unfortunately, does not provide the guarantee of peace. And this is not simply a theoretical point. I mean, there is a theoretical debate about this. But in the actions of individual Asian countries that have become China's biggest trading partners, they feel that this economic interdependence is creating uncertainties in a variety of areas which compel them to respond. And I think this is the heart of the problem. So it's not what the U.S. does or what the U.S. doesn't do. I think that's a derivative problem, and we need to pay attention to it. But if economic interdependence and China's growth as a result of that economic dependence ends up increasing suspicions rather than mitigating it, then I think this is a structural problem in competitive international politics that we have to kind of take seriously and address. Which brings me to the third point. yes, there is an element of balancing that will occur simply as a systemic property. But there is no assurance that balancing by itself will either suffice or be effective. I mean, the reason why over historical time you've had the rise of empires is simply because balancing did not produce the effects that people imagined they would. And it's not as if China in this game has no, what political scientists call agency. I mean, the Chinese will also be moving to break balances when they occur. They'll be moving to split up partnerships that may develop. And so in some sense, there is a competitive dynamic. And so I take your cautionary point as meaning that if we get involved in this game, we ought to do it smartly, and we ought to do it with a certain deliberation, as opposed to just trying to do it mechanistically and mindlessly. And I think we won't have a disagreement on that panel, on this panel on that.
Can I just respond to very quick points? And that is, I think it's a key question if China's heading back, I will say, toward a policy of reassurance or not. I don't think it's self-evident. I'm hopeful. There's some evidence, but there's so I think what China does will very much shape how this policy is implemented. So I would urge them to be more sophisticated and calibrated than they certainly were a couple of years ago and until recently. Secondly, though, and this is with Mike on I agree what the U.S. does. What we say is important. The most important is what we are and what our capacities are. And all the talk and all the policy is not going to substitute for a declining comprehensive national power. And by that I don't principally mean military, although I don't mean to exclude that. But I mean the foundations of our continued innovation and all that goes with that. And all the talk and all the policy doesn't matter if we get that wrong.
Amen.
Would you agree that one is necessary but not sufficient?
Sure.
Yeah. So it's not a binary choice.
No, but if you don't get
Sure.
the base of
That's
power
right.
right,
Sure.
then
that's the
I
core of
think-
everything.
Right.
Sure. Even a hardcore realist, especially a hardcore
yeah.
realist, I can agree with that.
We're off to a wonderful discussion. Thank you, everyone.